Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is a video lecture on the third section of my paper on the crisis in Islamic economics. In the first section of the paper, I explained how the Islamization of knowledge, the project of bringing Western knowledge within the framework of Islamic concepts, is of central importance to the Ummah. Islamic economics is one part of this project. In the second section, I explained how the second generation of Islamic economists abandoned the revolutionary goals of the first generation and decided to create Islamic economics as a mixture of Western capitalist economics and Islamic ideas. This project has failed because conventional economics itself has failed, and this is the purpose of this section 3. The crisis facing conventional or orthodox economics today is the same as the crisis that faced economics after the Great Depression of 1929. And for very much the same reasons. Just before the great crash of 1929, economists were supremely confident of their theories, and they were confident that the free market had brought them prosperity forever. When the great crash, the Great Depression, proved them supremely wrong. The same scenario repeated itself in the global financial crisis when just a few years before, Robert Lucas, in a presidential address to the American Economic Society, confidently claimed that we have solved the problem of prevention of recessions just before the Great Recession hit the US economy. There are actually two parallel crises under discussion. One is the economic crisis where people were thrown out of jobs, and the other is the crisis of economic theory, which said that people could not be unemployed for very long in large numbers under free markets. The Great Depression proved this wrong, and Keynes created macroeconomics to explain why one could have large amounts of unemployment for long periods of time. Then the neoclassical synthesis in the 60s rejected the central ideas of Keynes and went back to neoclassical ideas, saying that yes, the free market does guarantee full employment, and there is a natural rate which you cannot disturb by policy. So again, the global financial crisis of 2007 rejected all of the central pillars of macroeconomic theory up till that time, and the broken structure of macro still has not been resynthesized. We still are waiting for the new Keynes to come and put it back together. As explained in the previous lecture, the first generation Islamic economists had completely rejected capitalist economics and sought to explain that Islamic economics was a revolutionary alternative. The second generation rejected these insights and adopted most of neoclassical economic framework, saying that capitalist economics is more or less the same as Islamic economics. So the crisis in capitalist economics led automatically to a crisis in second generation Islamic economics as well. In previous lecture, I have explained how after the World War II, as the Islamic countries achieved liberation, they wanted to create economic systems along Islamic patterns, revolutionary and very different from capitalism and communism. However, when this effort failed in 1976, the Islamic Mecca conference, the Islamic economists decided to work with the capitalist structures and to make small modifications in them to achieve Islamic economics. This effort to fit Islamic economics into capitalist economics has failed, just as capitalist economics has failed. Our main goal in this lecture is to study the failure of conventional or orthodox economics. Why is it that it keeps producing these massive crises time after time after time? In this lecture, we will discuss 4 flaws, although there are many, many more, and it would take too much time to list all of them. But picking out just 4, they are the treatment of economic theories as universal laws in a mathematical form, the adoption of materialism, and the deceptive idea that economic theories are positive and not normative. So the first serious flaw is the misconception that economics is like physics and economic theories are like laws of physics. In the late 19th century, there was the Methodenstreit, a battle of methodologies, in which the original natural, historical, and qualitative approach to economics was replaced by a quantitative scientific approach based on attempting to imitate physics. And this bypassed the most fundamental question that, given a historical experience, how do we generalize from this? How do we create a universal law by looking at some patterns of history? There is no satisfactory answer to this question even now. Because there is really no way to generalize from historical experience of Europe, a false methodology was adapted where it was assumed that whatever happened in Europe was universal for all mankind, valid for all mankind. That was the way to get universal laws. And so the idea was to create a science which would be valid for all societies at all times, even though the laws were derived from the European experiences. And this attempt to turn qualitative and historical economics into a science of universal laws valid for all humanity has been a disastrous failure. To solve this problem, we need to go back to the historical qualitative approach. We need to understand that economic theory emerges out of an attempt to understand a particular society at a particular point of time. So you cannot understand economic theory without studying the society for which that theory was developed and by which that theory was developed. Also, we have to look at the effects of particular historical events which are not scientific in the sense that they only happen once. Like the 2 world wars had a tremendous impact on the evolution of monetary system and the system of trade. But this is not part of science. This is part of our historical experience. Similarly, the traditional economic organizations of societies are radically different from capitalism, and they have a lot to offer us in the way of positive models for how we can improve things. The second major problem is the adoption of a mathematical methodology in imitation of physics. What this leads to is the treatment of individuals and economic systems and societies as being subject to mathematical laws and subject to analysis by equations of motion. Many authors have remarked how bizarre assumptions are concealed under the cover of fancy mathematics and used to prove ideological agendas like the optimality of free markets. And this kind of abuse of mathematics has led to catastrophe, including the failure of economists to predict the global financial crisis because of very defective models. Problems of using the wrong kind of mathematics and the wrong kind of theoretical frameworks can be corrected by creating more realistic models of human behavior with diversity and heterogeneity. These can be handled in agent-based models which use complex simulations to create computer simulations of outcomes which are not subject to mathematical laws but capture the diversity of human behavior. Instead of equilibrium ideas which have been borrowed from physics incorrectly, we should use disequilibrium dynamics developed in physics, and also evolutionary economics, which based on the idea of how biological mechanisms evolve in the long run. All of these will create more appropriate mathematical models for economics. The third major problem is the materialism embodied in economic theory, which makes it a religion instead of a science. Economics teaches us the poisonous theory that our life goal should be the maximization of pleasure we achieve from consumption of goods and services. This has to be replaced by the idea that human beings are infinitely precious and they have infinite potential to achieve anything that they can want to be. And so the goal of economic, political, and social structures should be to enable every human being to realize his potential. The fourth fundamental flaw in economics is the idea that economics theories are positive. They describe how humans behave and not normative. They are a set of standards for rational behavior which we are all supposed to follow. Many authors have discussed how economics conceals hidden norms. So, for example, Junie Nelson writes that we are intrinsically, our nature makes us generous, but economics theory teaches us to be selfish. We would like to pursue higher visions and ideals, but economics teaches us that life is only about the pursuit of pleasure. We would like to act in socially responsible ways to help fellow human beings, but economics teaches us that we must maximize profits and that this life is a survival of the fittest in the jungle of fierce competition. So training like this, research shows that studying economics makes people more selfish and greedy. The antidote to this poison is to think of life as a spiritual journey, as Islam teaches us that we have the capability of being the highest of high. And to do this, we have to form a spiritual journey from nafs ammara, which is a very accurate description of homo economicus. When we make spiritual progress, you proceed to nafs lawwama and then to nafs mutmainna, which could be called the homo economics. So life is not about acting like homo economicus all the time, but it's actually denying yourself the pleasure. لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. Spending that which you love so as to tame the nafs and to make spiritual progress. So we can conclude our discussion by noting that modern economics is built on deeply flawed foundations, and it teaches poisonous values like survival of the fittest and selfish pursuit of pleasure as the goal of life. Islam teaches us to build a society on the standards of cooperation, responsibility, and a life of service to humanity. And these, the Islamic economists of the second generation wanted to create Islamic economics as a compromise, as a mixture of these two opposites. And that is why there is now a crisis in the second generation Islamic economics.